Okay, welcome everyone to this month's Ask Us Anything. A lot of good questions. I shared most of them in the follow-up email. We'll get stuck in to this session. Usual format, we'll go through athlete questions submitted. If there are questions during, probably pop them in the chat and we can go through those and we'll follow up with live Q&A. If there's something that I say or Elizabeth says that you really want clarification on, feel free to jump in. Just a quick one. Alan unfortunately can't join us today. He's got some PhD candidates that he has to take care of at Monash University. So unfortunately he can't join us, but he has shared some really fantastic insights into some of the questions that were asked today. So Elizabeth and I will be answering the questions. Okay. Could you define your way of thinking of the carb load in a practical way? And Pierre in Belgium asked this. What I'm going to do is just direct you to our YouTube channel. If you go to the most recent video, you will see that I covered carb load and did it in a practical way that you can cover in 30 minutes. And it goes through considerations during the week in terms of reducing fiber, the foods to consume, when to consume them, and the total amounts you should aim to consume in the 24 to 48 hours prior to the race, and then goes through race breakfast as well, Pierre. So go onto YouTube and have a look at that. The next question, I struggle with overeating at night when the meals are yellow. I always have an evening workout around 6-ish and supper at 7:30 or later. Some workouts have calories, i.e. we're providing fuel within them, but it doesn't seem to matter. I am still hungry. How can I work around this? Elizabeth, you're going to tackle this one.
Yes, I asked for this specifically because I too have had those like late night after. I don't like to do the 6:30 workout, but when you do have them, I think a couple things I would ask Phil, what is that evening meal consisting of? Are you making sure that you're properly refueling with protein and carbohydrates and a good bit of fat in there? So are you following kind of our instruction? And are you hitting the higher side of the carbohydrate mark? So in that yellow coloring, you can go, we suggest about 50, but the green meal is kind of 80-ish to 100. So you could push those carbs up a little bit. I would suggest potentially looking at your snack beforehand. Are you refueling? Or are you fueling beforehand with enough? And then if the hunger component is still there, I would try a couple days of front loading or back loading calories, I guess is the right way. So potentially having slightly less in the morning and then a little more in the evening so that you're still meeting your targets. You're just dispersing them a little bit differently. This is why nutrition is entirely personalized. Like we do the best that we can to make sure that you're meeting all of these. However, if you might be pushing a little harder in the session than it says, like it could say a zone 2 and that's what we think you're doing, and you might end up at zone 3, 4. We don't know if you did or didn't snack earlier or if you've checked all of the boxes. So really trying to play around with, first of all, making sure that you're actually getting the right amounts that we're suggesting, and then potentially changing that distribution a bit. And finally, if there's time, I realize you're kind of eating late. If there's time to have a shake before bed, that kind of protein only shake, that often helps me with fullness too. Oh, Scott, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you for that, E. What I would add to that, Phil, is the possibility that you have sweated quite a lot during that session, and depending on how much you've lost, you may want to try and aim to replace that fluid fairly immediately as well. So if you've lost, say, 500 grams, you would want to replace roughly, 750 to 1 liter of fluid afterwards. Now, in doing that, that will probably help to satiate you a little bit as well, because it's going to fill up your stomach. So you're also going to get the hydration element, but you're also probably going to feel a little bit fuller because it's going to distend the stomach. So that is something that you could look at doing. And I'm not sure if you're managing your hydration specifically. And as Alan highlighted, you know, within that sort of hour to 2 hour period, that's your key time frame to sort of rehydrate and get that into you. Phil, are you on the call? I don't even know if you're on.
He is.
Yes. Does that help, Phil? How are you managing your hydration?
He says, okay.
Are you there?
Yep.
Yeah, yeah.
there-
Talking. Yeah, my hydration is I mean, take a shower and start eating right away.
It's just dropping in and out, Phil. You always seem to have a connection issue. Maybe just turn your camera off and see if that helps. Anyway, well, just put it in the chat, Phil, and then we'll cover that at the end, just so we can get through the questions. Okay. Next question, Elliot Block. I hope Elliot's on this call because I know he threw this question at us as a hypothetical, but it's not so much a hypothetical because I know the man can sweat and he takes in a lot of sodium. So the hypothetical question was, I sweat out roughly 1.8 liters per hour on runs and have a sodium content of, you know, very specific amount, and that was measured by precision hydration. Just we'll talk about that. Hot and humid climate because he lives in Hawaii. How much should I drink and how much sodium should I take for a 3-hour run? Okay, so Alan actually came back with some pretty good information regarding this. So related to fluid, what he said was if Elliot was aiming for less than 2% body mass loss to potentially optimize performance, then 2% of 71 kilos, because that's what he weighs, is 1.4 kilos, okay? And therefore 1.4 kilos is 1,400 milliliters or 1.4 liters. So that would be if you're aiming for a maximum fluid deficit, okay? If the sweat rate, if he's got a sweat rate, as it says, of 1.8 liters per hour, that's a total of 5.4 liters over 3 hours lost. So if he's losing 5.4 liters and wants to only be in a 1,400 mil deficit, i.e. 2%, then that's a total of 4,000 mils or 4 liter fluid loss that he needs, 4,000 mils that he needs to consume over the 3 hours, okay? 4,000 mils or 4 liters over 3 hours is roughly 1,300 mils an hour. Now, that's a lot of fluid for anyone to be taking in whilst drinking. I know Elliot is very good at drinking fluid, but he may not hit that. So a more reasonable amount may be closer to 1 liter or 1,000 milliliters per hour, okay? And that would result in him having around a 3.5% deficit, which is still completely fine to finish a run, a 3-hour run with a 3.5% deficit. So Elliot, in your case, that's sort of what you'd be aiming for, around 1,000 mils or a liter per hour to maintain that deficit. Now, in terms of sodium, sodium needs is obviously dependent on his sweat sodium concentration, which he gave a very specific amount, which is around that 1,380 milligrams per liter or around 60 millimoles per liter. And it's also dependent on the percentage of fluid losses replaced, okay? At that type of sodium concentration, which is above average, but not necessarily extreme, he probably doesn't need to replace a specific amount of sodium unless he's drinking enough fluid to replace 65% of his sweat rate. Okay, so effectively, if he can only get in a liter of fluid per hour, that's the equivalent of 55% replacement, which means that the total amount of sodium that he actually has to take in may not be as high because his blood sodium concentration will rise because he's not actually meeting his sweat loss amount. And I hope that's not confusing for everyone. If he did actually manage to hit that total amount that Alan described to keep the 2% loss, then he would actually be replacing around 70-75% of his fluid loss, and then a specific amount of sodium could be taken in to maintain fluid balance. and that would be around 900 milligrams per hour. I know Elliot tends to take in a little bit higher than that, and that's based on his amounts, but somewhere probably between that 900 and 1,000 milligrams per hour if he was hitting that full sort of 1.3 liters per hour intake of fluid. So I guess the big take home from this is you have to manage your sodium intake relative to the amount of fluid that you're taking in. If you are not taking in the amount of fluid that is required to replace, say, greater than 65% of your actual fluid losses, then the amount of sodium you take in can be more related to what is comfortable from a taste perspective and what you feel comfortable with. If you are taking in, greater than that 65% of your sweat rate loss, then the specific amount of sodium could be applied. I hope that helps. I know that's probably a lot of information for a lot of people to take in. I think the big thing here is it is very specific to the individual, and you need to understand what your relative sweat rate is and what your ability to take in fluid is in these conditions. And that is where doing repeated sweat rate tests in the Fuelin app can help you determine what your sweat rate is and also what your ability to take in fluids. You can then work out, are you taking in more than that 65% of your fluid loss? And if not, you can probably just manage your sodium intake based on taste.
And I think too, Scott, to bring it back to the app, I've had athletes before that'll do maybe 3 or 4 sweat tests and go, okay, we have an average, but those were done under different conditions, different times of year, different types of sessions, maybe a brick session, maybe a bike or a run. That it's really important to consistently do enough bike sessions, enough run sessions. And if you're racing, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, the rest of this year, in very hot conditions, that's what we're in now. So if you were doing sweat testing back in March and haven't done any recently, the temperatures are different. There's different circumstances. So really putting that consistency in to get some accurate readings, because they will be different on the bike and the run for a lot of people. They will be different when it's 30 degrees, well, not quite 30, but when it's significantly warmer or significantly more humid.
Yeah, look, I'm just going to say, key takeaway here, get a minimum of 10 tests on the bike, 10 on the run, at below that sort of 85, and hopefully 10 at around that 85. Now, obviously, if you can't get quite enough in terms of 80 at 85, look, if you're close enough to that, mark it in as a hot test. But certainly 10 on the bike, 10 on the run at cooler temperature and hotter temperatures, and start to look at what the averages are there. I think that should be the absolute minimum that every athlete is looking to do.
Yes.
Okay, and just on that, Elliot has done about 50 for each run and bike at different temperatures, so he actually does understand this, but he was certainly trying to test us.
He is. Sure. No one will ever compare. Elliot is like the master of sweat tests for sure.
Okay, could you discuss the timing of caffeine before races and key workouts, including the type of caffeine, such as coffee versus cola versus caffeine in gels and products? Does consuming caffeine at a correct time promote improved performance? Thank you, Mary. Elizabeth?
Excellent question, Mary. So let's start off with does consuming caffeine at the correct time promote improved performance? Yes, pretty much across the board, unless you are a non kind of receptor to caffeine, which is a different category. Yes, athletes, it is a known ergogenic aid. It does improve performance when utilized correctly. When we're talking about caffeine and you say the type, caffeine is caffeine. The differences that you see in coffee versus cola versus gels would be 2 things. The amount of caffeine varies widely between even the same cup of coffee or a cup of coffee from the same pot that you brew or the same coffee shop that you have it at, versus cola that has other carbohydrates in it versus gels. So within those different sources, there's a widely different amount of caffeine and other ingredients in it that could also, we all know carbohydrates improve performance. And when it comes to dose and timing, 200 milligrams is the dose that they use in the studies that we find beneficial. And timing, we recommended about halfway through your bike, potentially before in the morning before your race, if you're having a cup of coffee, potentially halfway through on the run. The thing with caffeine, though, is really understanding how your body responds to it, how much you need, and what that timing is that works for you. So some people do not respond, or they don't feel like they respond to caffeine right away, but about 30 to 45 minutes later, they start to feel a bit of alertness. Other people can feel caffeine 15 to 20 minutes when they take that 200 milligram bolus. I personally like to use and recommend like the caffeine pills that have the 200 milligrams in them, just because it's one single shot, you know you're getting it. It's easy to do with timing, whereas gels, they're nice to have, but most of them have between 100 and 150 milligrams, so that different dose. And the cola, you're getting them from the little Dixie cups, so how much you're getting, if you're actually taking it all in, if you're spilling it, how consistently you're taking those. Unless you're standing there and actually downing an entire soda, you're not getting the amount of caffeine needed. So yes, timing matters. Yes, source matters, amount matters, and definitely test it out on your different rides and runs so that you know about how it affects you.
Thanks, C. I think the only thing I will add to that is you talked about the amounts, and you talked about the amount and sort of 200 milligrams and what's been studied. I guess with some athletes, you know, just be aware that smaller athletes may struggle with the 200 milligrams, and that's something to take into account. 0.3 milligrams per kilo body weight is often used as a way of calculating the amount of caffeine that maybe someone should ingest. So if you're a 50-kilo athlete, then that would be around 150 milligrams, which obviously sits right in between that sort of 100 and 200 milligrams. But, you know, what I would generally suggest is, you know, maybe trial 100 milligrams, trial 200 milligrams, see how you respond to that. I, on the other hand, have sort of started using the caffeinated gels, the ones with 100 milligrams in them, for athletes, and it seems to be working well, knowing that they take those back to back, so fairly close proximity, say within 10 to 15 minutes of each other, if they are on the run in particular, and that can give you the 200 milligrams of caffeine, plus obviously, you know, between 50 and 60 grams of carbs. So that's sort of how I've been using that. And also 60 minutes before the start of the swim, you could look at taking in a gel or a caffeinated gel or a caffeine pill, as Elizabeth hinted at. Peak concentrations of caffeine will often be in the system between around 45 and 60 minutes. The half-life of caffeine is, depending on the individual, somewhere between 4 hours and 6 hours as well. So you need to factor that in as to how much total caffeine you're going to have in your system. Now, the only other thing I would say about caffeine is you can take in more than 0.3 milligrams per kilo body weight across the course of the race. So the 0.3 milligrams is usually taken as the single sort of ingested amount. And then you can look at having, you know, multiple amounts of caffeine throughout that sort of 5 or 10 hour period, depending on the length of the race. So, but certainly too much caffeine can be very dangerous. Certainly if you're starting to get over 10 milligrams per kilo body weight, you start to see adverse effects of caffeine. So in the case of caffeine, more is not always better. You certainly need to find what your limit is and how that affects your body. Cool. Anything else?
Yep. Good on that one.
Just a quick question. Did
Yeah,
you
yeah.
say 0.3 milligrams per kilo?
0.3. So if you're 50 kilos, that'd be 150 milligrams. If you're a 70 kilo athlete, you're up to 210.
Oh, I'm kind of portly at 90, so.
Yeah. So, and that's the point, is obviously it gets up higher, doesn't it? You're up now you're 90, so you're at 270. So that's where, you might find you need a little bit extra caffeine, and the 100 milligram gel. And this is to Elizabeth's point, the 100 milligram gels may not be sufficient enough for you. You may require that 200 milligram bolus in one hit to even feel it. And then, if you're a habitual coffee drinker and so on, it may require a little bit more caffeine to give you a buzz.
Thank you.
Cool. I just completed my 10th Ironman. Unfortunately, I continue to struggle with significant nausea on the run and vomiting. I could hardly get anything down, and fueling, hydrating became a problem. I followed my hydration and fueling plan on the bike, but maybe not heat acclimated or acclimatized. 60 grams of carbs, between 800 and 900 milligrams of sodium, and 24 ounces of fluids per hour based on prior sweat and hydration testing. I did well on my recent 70.3 distance with similar heat, this time walking most of the marathon run and costing me my Kona slot. Any insight into prevention and or what to do when this happens on the run? How to get out of this nausea hole? Any great plans B or C? Dr. Amy Fletcher. Firstly, Amy, we're certainly not going to be able to answer all of this on here. And I think I have suggested in the past, probably a consult would be the best thing for you. Alan put in his notes around this. He said, it is obviously very hard to get out of the nausea hole once you're in it. Gut problems are very complex, and there can be multiple causes that cause different symptoms in many different people, and you can have multiple issues going on all at the same time. So there's not really one size fits all answer to this question, and it needs, as he said, a one-on-one coaching support to overcome it. These are the possible reasons, or a combination of any of these could be the result or resulting in what's happening. So prolonged elevated body temperature, as we know that increasing core temperature can result in issues with gastric emptying and absorption. This could be related to lack of heat acclimation, whether that's passive or active, but certainly not limited to that. Hydration intake, again, we don't know exactly how many sweat tests and fueling tests Dr. Fletcher has done. So that would be something to investigate, with potential that she's either overhydrated or underhydrated. The types of carbs she's mentioned, 60 grams of carbs here, but we don't know the types of carbs in terms of the glucose fructose ratio, but also were they gels, bars, blocks, or fluids during that race? Was it enough or was it not enough? The presence of fiber or potential what we call FODMAPs in the gut from the day before. Was fiber reduced? Were FODMAPs known or unknown consumed in the days leading up, and that could have caused some distress? What caffeine? We just discussed caffeine. Caffeine can impact carbohydrate utilization, but it can also impact gastric emptying and absorption. Are there any medications being used, things like ibuprofen? And is that impacting, say, how the gut is functioning? Stress response, obviously we have the physical stress response, but we also have psychological factors. Potentially, we do know that psychological stress related to previous experience can actually cause some issues with the gut. And if this is occurring on a regular basis, maybe Dr. Fletcher is actually becoming quite anxious about that, and that could be impacting her gut performance. The potential for genetic predisposition to some GI issues, poor gut tolerance. We don't know how much testing or practicing of high carbohydrate fueling has gone on in the past, and has that been at specific race pace? Is there any underlying medical conditions that need to be explored? And certainly, and they would be the main points. It certainly would take, and I would stress on this, if you are an athlete who does suffer similar conditions, that all of these factors that Alan has outlined would be taken care of in a one-to-one consultation. And I think when you have an issue as complicated as this, it is worth leaning in on the experts to assist you with it, because it obviously is concerning. It is obviously ruining this athlete's race, and as she said, costing her a slot at Kona at this point in time. Is there anything you want to add to that? I know Alan was pretty comprehensive with his answer.
I guess just highlighting that you listed 11 different possible things there. And so start checking off the boxes to make time to have a consult, but also, you know, if this is something that's repeated, it doesn't have to be. That's the other thing. I think a lot of athletes think like, oh yeah, of course I'm going to feel awful. Of course I'm going to feel nauseous. And it's like, hopefully there are ways to mitigate around that. But yeah, too many variables just to pick one.
Yeah. Okay. Should I run with the same electrolyte mix all day? I know I'll drink less during the morning, cool hours. It's that, or go with a lighter blend in the AM and double up when it gets hot. Thanks. Jason Sullivan asked this. Again, Alan had a comment around this, and what we assumed is that Jason is talking about racing. I guess he's talking about racing, but it could be applied to training as well. Look, as a general rule, and I would agree with this, you can just use the same mix. It's certainly not a perfect relationship between fluid and sodium balance, but it's often just the practical or the practicalities of this. If the reason you can do this is because, as we highlighted with Elliot's response, if you're drinking less fluid than you're getting in, then less sodium is also being consumed. And so you can manage it that way. You know, technically you could, Jason, use a lighter blend when it's earlier and then can sort of switch into a more concentrated blend if you know that the temperature in the race is going to rise as you go through. But honestly, very few athletes do that. I think it's a lot of faff and probably not required. So that would be sort of both our response. Again, this would be something that you would want to practice in training. Again, base it on your sweat rates, base it on, you know, does that electrolyte mix, does it contain carbohydrates as well? Are you getting your carbohydrates from other sources, i.e. gels or chews during the run? And how are you managing that? But it would probably most likely come down to what you've practiced and try and make it specific to the conditions you're going to face in the race. Okay. Do you have any supplement advice for high heart rate when running off the bike, besides the obvious electrolytes and nutrition, which I thought was enough? My heart rate runs high off the bike, and I thought maybe hydration, but I have read about supplements helping too. Thoughts, Carol Ann Hood. E, you're going to answer this.
Yes.
I'm going to say I don't think it's too much related to supplements and stuff, but I'll let you answer this.
And I specifically picked this because I know Carol Ann, and we've talked, we have had some consults together in conversations. I don't believe that it's a nutrition specific issue, more of a training issue. So that's probably something, my first step would be to suggest with your coach why your heart rate is up and potentially work on a strategy to get that lower while you're running. In terms of nutrition, I don't know specifically what supplements you've heard or ones that you're speaking of. I know that, you know, for people with chronically high blood pressure, they offer garlic and potassium and B1, but it doesn't sound like that's your issue. So I think it's very much training specific. I would also say the runs off the bike. Did you, and I know you put in here electrolytes and nutrition, but did you actually fuel those properly on some of those sessions? Yeah, I would say it's more of a training issue than a nutrition issue.
Yeah, I mean, that it relates to cardiac drift as much as anything, doesn't it? So, you know, whether she's just going too high above, you know, threshold on the bike, and that's causing this drift to occur. So, yeah, I would say it's probably not nutrition per se, unless, of course, maybe heat. She's getting too hot, and that's because she's not managing her hydration strategy on the bike. And again, Carol Ann, that would just come down to, you know, managing your fluid intake, and that's probably water as much as anything and keeping yourself cool and using some of those cooling strategies. So think about that. Whole body wettedness, covering your face and your whole body in water, spraying the water bottles over yourself, especially if it is hot. Okay. I often participate in century bike rides. It seems like no matter how much I consume during the ride, I struggle for the final 20 miles. It is simply due to the amount of carbs. Is it simply due to the amount of carbs I consumed the day before? Matt, Elizabeth, you've got this one.
I would say yes and no. Yes, the importance of getting that higher carbohydrate before a ride like a century really does make a difference. And if you're not used to, if we have in the app you consuming 400, 500 grams, and you're not used to that amount, definitely the time to start upping that. And as Scott alluded to earlier, we did a carb loading session last week and it was fantastic with a lot of practical tips. So I would say, look at that. And then, yes, what you're consuming during the ride definitely plays into how you're feeling in those final 20 miles. So are you getting that 90 to 120 grams of carbs? Are you mixing the glucose fructose? Are you getting some solid food in? Like 100 miles can take some athletes a good bit of time, 6 to 7-ish plus hours. It's a long time to be on the bike. Are you being consistent with your hydration? And then are you, again, this isn't a nutrition piece, but are you pacing properly? I've been in century rides before at that beginning part when everyone's leaving the gate and, you're riding faster than you should be at the beginning. So did pacing play a bit into that as well?
Yeah. I've often seen this and athletes say it seems like no matter how much I consume during the ride, I just struggle. And then you actually start recording what you're consuming and it turns out you're only consuming about 40 or 50 grams an hour. Plus you're under consuming fluids relative to your sweat loss. So it comes back to what we're talking about at the start. It's like being really systematic about this and actually documenting what you're doing and doing that repeatedly, because I can probably guarantee that the amount of calories being taken in is not measurable to what's actually probably being expended. And so learning how to take in that higher amount of carbs or total energy, and that may involve eating, some bars, which are just total calories with some fat for total calories, depending on the pace of the ride, that could be an option as well. And then, as he said, certainly the day before, minimum of 8 grams per kilo body weight. But, in this case, depending on the size of Matt, he may be wanting to go, 10 to 12 grams per kilo body weight. And, getting that in is a struggle and you need to be tracking that as well.
Yep.
If my goal in the app shows to be 2150 calories and I complete a workout that burns 1100 calories, is my goal still 2150 or is it 3250? Mario, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I selected this one because I really have a bent about when our watches say that we burn 1100 calories or a treadmill machine says we burn 800 calories. I think important to remember that they are highly inaccurate. They're either plus or minus up to about 20%, depending on the type of activity you were doing, depending on how often you wear this device, the type of the length. So just because it says you burned 1100 calories doesn't necessarily mean you actually burned 1100 calories. So let's start with that. But if we assume that, yes, you did burn 1100 calories, if it was that kind of a session, we would have been fueling you during and throughout the session. And so, no, your total caloric intake is the 2150, but the app doesn't take it, that total doesn't take into account the in-session fueling that we recommend. So I'm guessing an 1100 calorie session, gosh, that had to have been a 4-ish plus hour ride, let's say. So during that ride, we would have given you at, around that many. So yes, you're consuming them and yes, your daily total is, but that's not counted towards your daily total. So follow the fueling instructions that we give on the app based on the activity that you have put in there. And if the activity description isn't correct, then make sure you go in and do that so we know how to properly fuel you.
Yeah, and just to reinforce that key message, the macro target that you have on a daily basis does not have the in-session fueling included in that. Okay, so focus on the in-session fueling that's recommended, and then focus on your daily macros outside of that. Okay, this question is about the run leg of an Ironman race where I experienced a massive muscular decline after roughly the halfway mark. My quad started hurting badly, forcing me to slow down. I started the run well fueled after being able to execute my fueling plan as practice in training. What stood out in the race was the number of times I had to pee on the bike 3 times and run twice. I executed my hydration and electrolyte intake as in training, so I was surprised by the amount I lost. It was also a hot day, so even more surprisingly, do you think overhydration could cause my issues on the run? And if yes, how can you counteract this during the race, where you still have to fuel and hydrate to ensure that you get the calories in for the run? What's your name? And Alan went into this, and so he said, look, possibly yes, Andy, that but more information is required. So you may have overhydrated. I guess, was the fluid intake on the bike matching expected sweat loss? Were you trying to keep the the rate of body weight percentage loss down to certainly less than 1%? If that was the case, then that may have been playing a role here. So you could have been taking in too much fluid, and that could have resulted in some of these issues with muscular contractions and that feeling of like dead legs. You would certainly need to provide probably more information related to this. The fact that you have peed 3 times on the bike and probably on the run twice would indicate that there has been an overconsumption of fluid. In terms of how do you counteract this during a race, we need to slow down your consumption of fluid. And I think this is where obviously having a plan A and a plan B and listening to your body and also, assessing the conditions is really important. Yes, you want to have an idea of how much fluid to drink and consume in order to maintain your percentage of body weight loss based on the testing you've done, but you don't need to be rigid to that plan, okay? If you're suddenly peeing a lot, then you need to probably slow down with that consumption, knowing that you potentially are over-consuming. And then this comes back to what Alan covered in his masterclasses around hydration, is what is the minimum sweat rate that you know that you have, and therefore apply that to drinking that in calories or carbohydrates, and then probably consuming the rest of your carbohydrates in more gel or block form so that you can manage the hydration element accordingly. So what you don't want to be stuck in is drinking all your carbohydrates, because if you don't need to actually get in that amount of fluid, then you're in a bit of a sticky situation, knowing that if you continue to drink, you may potentially be overhydrating whilst getting in the carbs, and then that can cause some of these issues that you've described. Okay, this might not be the right forum, but looking for fueling advice with stomach sensitivity and digestive issues. Currently working hard to consume enough calories to live and train. I'm figuring out what I can and cannot eat. Gluten and chicken are out so far. I only run on the treadmill in my house because I can't trust my gut in the wild. Hoping to do a local marathon in December, but I have concerns about fueling pre and during the race. Thank you. Michelle Reeves. Elizabeth, you were going to handle this one.
Michelle, so I think another excellent opportunity for a consult with Scott or Alan or myself to kind of go through, really look at what you're consuming on a daily basis. And if we see any potential red flags or things that might be aggravating your stomach. I think if you really are having digestive issues, FODMAPs is something that's kind of an easy route to go down in terms of removing things from your diet and adding them back in one by one. The gluten and chicken, it's an interesting combination of things. I don't see a connection per se, but again, everyone's different. If you found some kind of link or some of those to have bothered you, I would guess just by reading this, I get the idea that there's probably some underlying gut issues that you would want to address. So I would look at, are you taking in the glutamine that helps with gut healing and sensitivity after training? Have you looked at different probiotics, the timing of your meals, the types of food that your carbohydrates that you're taking in during your training sessions? I think if you're trying to consume too much, that could potentially give issues. So starting small and kind of building up. I found the precision gels in terms of fueling for pretty much every athlete I've worked with, especially the ones with gut sensitivity issues, they work really, really well. So that's something that I would be fairly confident in you trying on one of your treadmill runs. And then obviously avoiding eating too soon before your training and slowly starting to get closer and closer. So right now you need 2 hours between a meal and a run. Try an hour 45, then an hour 30, and play around with the different types of meals as well.
Yeah, I guess, and thank you. I think, Michelle, obviously not knowing you as an athlete and where you sit with this and what your actual fueling strategy is, I think first and foremost, and Alan brought this up, you may actually have a clinical gastrointestinal issue. We recently had an athlete who was suffering from similar conditions to this, went through a consult, actually then, again, depending on your age and family history and that, had further investigation, had a gastroscopy and colonoscopy, and was diagnosed with celiac disease. And obviously that then takes priority over, these types of issues, and actually working through that and managing that clinical diagnosis is very important. So it is first and foremost really important to get a thorough understanding of what is actually happening. And again, that, trying to manage that yourself, I probably would not recommend that. And, whether you use us or whether you use someone else, but certainly I would seek, and Alan as a registered dietitian as well, would recommend that you seek out professional help to ensure and at least exclude any clinical presentations of something like, a celiac disease diagnosis or anything. And then I think further to that, gluten and chicken, pretty common. We hear these sorts of things, and it's got actually nothing to do with gluten and chicken. If you don't have celiac disease, as Elizabeth highlighted, gluten, it may be the forms of carbohydrate that you're consuming, which is more related to FODMAPs, which is these fermentable types of starches or carbohydrates that could be causing issues. Chicken, unless you're allergic to chicken, I can't honestly see how that would be impacting your gut unless you're eating maybe a rotisserie chicken just before going out and doing a run, but probably highly, we wouldn't advise that. So I think what this comes down to is actually being systematic again. And for all the athletes out there, you're probably sick of us saying this, but it's being systematic in the approach and really dialing in how you are going about fueling, what types of carbohydrates you are using, and then going through that. And often it is a pretty simple solution if there is no underlying clinical diagnosis there of, going through all those points that Alan highlighted in the previous question and just going through them and making sure that we can eradicate those. For those of you who aren't on Fuelin, obviously we do have a plan which works out at less than $1 a day, and you get world-class nutrition advice for, as we say, less than $1 a day. So can't really complain about the price, and hopefully for those of you that are on it certainly are benefiting from it. And we're seeing some pretty spectacular results with racing at the moment, and from age groupers all the way through to professional athletes. So it does sync directly with Training Peaks, today's plan and final surge. So you have the same customized training program that world-class and world champion athletes are using. Okay, let's stop the share there. And
Are you taking general questions?
Yeah, we can go into it. Let me just answer this from Phil. With the worked out, he takes a shower, eating supper within 10 to 20. So for sure, I'm not drinking enough water before eating. So back to Phil's question. Yeah, Phil, I would probably say, mate, after you weigh, like just weigh yourself in the evening, weigh yourself before the session, after the session. You've lost, you're a bigger guy. You may have lost, I can personally attest this. I can lose 700 to 1,000 mils in an hour in a hard session. You may need to drink 1 liter to 2 liters of fluid, and get that in quickly before you have the shower. Let that sit in your gut, knowing that your gut is going to distend. You distend what's called mechanoreceptors in the stomach. That then goes to the brain. It takes a little bit of time for that message to get to the brain. That may help with that satiation. And I think that could be something really good. Drinking, even if you don't drink the full liter, just drinking 500 mils. And look, if you want to add a little bit of sodium to it, whether a pinch of salt or small amount of electrolytes, that may really help. And you could just try that and see. Obviously, the only caveat, and I have had this with a pro athlete where we were drinking more fluid to replace fluid losses, was that you don't want to disrupt sleep. Okay, so don't drink so much fluid that it's got you up all night going to the toilet, because then obviously recovery is going to be disrupted as well. So it is a fine line, and that's part of the issue with training at night. Cool. Awesome, Phil. Okay, Manuel, I think you had a question.
Sir. Yeah, I was curious. Have you guys seen any, let's see, what are the effects of blood thinners on endurance athletes?
I'm not going to answer that because I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay.
The
reason I was asking is that I crashed
like
and
aspirin?
burned. No, like
Beta blockers.
I think so. I forget. I had heart surgery a couple of years ago, and they put me on thinners, and then I went into a 70.3 and crashed and burned. Didn't have the energy to continue, so I'm off of them now. But I'm just curious, what would that have been
it could
contributing
be
factor?
again, Manny, like I think with something like that, it's such a personal,
Right.
case for yourself. I would say it would be, certainly I'm not going to be, I wouldn't suggest that I'm the person for you for that. I would suggest probably a dietitian in this case, and probably someone like Alan, unless you've got experience with Elizabeth. But I would be
I've got an
talking to a
upcoming consult
dietitian
with
and probably a
Elizabeth, so
doctor.
yeah. Well, the doctor
Okay.
took me off of it already, so I'm done with that. But I was just curious. I'm hoping not to experience the same result on my upcoming 70.3.
Yeah, it's probably, look, again, I don't know what the effect of that be, but if you're off that and you're fueling properly, you've got your total intakes right. We don't know if you did a proper carb load leading into that. So many factors that Elizabeth will cover in all those in the console.
Okay. All right. Thanks. I was just curious.
Yeah, for sure. We'll follow up on that though. We'll see if we can. I might ask Alan or E. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I do just a little, but Manny, since you're not on them currently, as long as you've been off of them for over 60 days, that shouldn't be a factor in changing performance. But there are definitely, when you're on statins or beta blockers, that does affect respiratory fitness and can have an impact. But again, your situation, I think, is different. It would be really important for anyone that's listening to this or still on to speak with your cardiologist about using them and doing heavy endurance training. And preferably a cardiologist that deals with sports medicine. So I would say that would be really important to do before, not so much a sprint or Olympic distance, but a 70.3 or above.
What's Amber's name? The cardiologist that we had on. What's his surname?
Oh.
If you go back, Manny, if you go back into our YouTube videos, we actually did a Q&A with a cardiologist who's actually a Fuelin athlete, but is also a cardiologist and works with athletes. And he might be a good person to actually connect with and maybe do a call with if you are concerned about that.
It was
'Cause he has a very
looking
good
in the archive.
understanding.
It was not this February, the February previous. So 2022 February is when we had Amber
Yeah.
on.
What was the name?
His name is Amber. I can't remember his surname, but we
I'll
can get
take a
that to
look.
you as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, Elizabeth will send you a message in the Fuelin app.
Thank you.
Cool. Phil, your question. Look, mate, I'd get a consult in, sooner rather than later to deal with all your questions, and then at least you work on them in the build up to your Ironman, and then you can always have follow up. I think it's one of those ones, like if you've got pressing issues and you need to, address them, then sort of don't wait for it. I always find the athletes who deal with the things quickly and then put into practice what was discussed, they have much better outcomes than trying to figure out themselves, waiting to the last minute and then sort of going, I need help. And then you start doing, and they're like, oh my God, I sort of wasted 6 months. So, it's just the way it is. Carol Ann, did that answer your question? Great to see you on the call. Is that useful about the caffeine?
Yep, it helped. Yeah, I think I just need to run more. And yeah, definitely. I don't know. I Googled something about supplements. So I guess that was kind of stupid.
It's
always Dr. Google is always dangerous.
Not stupid, very natural, I think. We've been trained to go and search for an answer. So I commend you for wanting to look.
Yeah.
Glad you ran some stuff by us for sure.
I think the big thing about supplements, guys, and I often will term them complements. They are just simply complementing your diet. They are not your diet. They're not going to suddenly make you superhuman. Talked about this even in with carbohydrates. The carbohydrates are technically a supplement. Yeah. They're not going, especially in the refined form like gels and fluids and that, they're not going to suddenly make you, world champion. Okay. They will assist your training, your underlying training program, and then having nutrition fit with that is what's going to make you a better athlete. Viewing them separately, viewing nutrition, training, and then supplementation as separate entities is certainly not the right approach. You want to be looking at it as each of them are going to be working together, and certainly, the supplements is the sprinkle on top. There are some really good supplements out there that can provide benefit to you, but again, those benefits are probably in the percentages, the single digit percentages versus say a really good training program which is structured with the appropriate day-to-day nutrition. That's what's going to bring the benefits. Okay. And sticking to that and being consistent with that over time is what's going to give you, the results that you're expecting. It's just unfortunately the way it is. And in the day we live, everyone wants things instantly, and
and I think too, to highlight the importance of getting blood labs done, because if there is a deficiency, that complementary supplement can become an essential component, like with something like very, very low vitamin D or iron, ferritin levels, B12. So I always worry when people will start to pick things without really digging in and knowing kind of what's going on inside. So be sure to do that as well.
For sure.
Test.
Well, very good. Does anyone have any follow-up questions? Anything else that wasn't answered? I know the question around Elliot's sweat test was there were a lot of numbers and things, and you may have to listen to it again to get an understanding, but we'll go from there. If there's no more questions, something in the chat. Lift chair. Okay.
Oh, Phil, when's a good time to do a consultation?
No, I covered that. That's good.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining. Hopefully we answered your questions, and if we didn't answer your questions, then next month get your questions in, and we'll take it from there. Cool.
Nice to
See
see you.
everyone. Oh, and if you can just fill in the questionnaire at the end and just let us know if the session was good and feedback on what you want, moving forward. We'll take it from there.
All right, guys, have a good week.
See you, everyone. Bye-bye.